Okay, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group, the Hannah Arendt Center virtual reading group, where we're currently in the middle of reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. As at this point, I think most of you know, the book is divided into three parts, I guess, one way to put it. One would be the prologue, introduction, and chapter on the private and the public. Then there's a long middle part of the book, which is where we're in right now, which is often considered by many people to be the core of the book, where she has chapters on what she calls the three faculties of the human condition: labor, work, and action. And then there'll be the long final chapter on the vita activa and the modern age, which is really the heart of the book, and often has not been understood to be, but is. And when we get there, I hope we'll understand why. So today, we are coming to the conclusion of the chapter on labor. We need to take, this is an important meeting, and it's sad that it's on a holiday because I know we have fewer people than usual, but the premise of the book is that the human condition is changing, or is at least in the process of changing. What is the human condition? Again, it's not human nature. It is the way we are conditioned beings. That is the way we're conditioned beings who live in a world. The premise here, and one we can challenge, is that that human beings have, for a long time, to put it mildly, and let me now put it a little more gespitzed, a little more in a way provocatively. The human beings have really, since the beginning of collective human life, where we've lived in cities and towns, we human beings have been born into a world such that we are conditioned in such a way that there are basic activities, fundamental faculties and activities that we engage in that have become part of what it means to be human. They're not natural, right? There's no natural need for humans to labor, work, or act per se. They are conditioned needs. And Arendt is saying that something about the modern age, so the last chapter, the vita activa and the modern age, something about the modern age is in the process of potentially transforming the human condition as we've known it. Again, which will not get rid of humans, will not get rid of human nature, but will result in a new way that humans are. And she says, that's happening. And it's not that we can or should fully stop it. And it's not that it's going to be all good or all bad. But we need to think about it. We need to think, and she says we need to think what we are doing. And that's why she's writing the book. I think it's important for me to say this at the beginning of this chapter because, in this chapter on labor and these last two sections of the labor chapter we're going to read today, there's going to be a lot of, I think, potentially controversial claims that she's going to make. And they're going to be claims that some people are going to find scary, and others will find problematic for other reasons. But the overarching claim that she wants to make, and I just want us to understand that, is that of these three human faculties, labor, work, and action, all of which are part of what she calls the active life, or the vita activa. The active life itself in the modern age, or actually in longer than the modern age, has replaced the contemplative life, the life of contemplation, as the highest aspect of human activity. But that's not even the most important part. That's not at all the most important part of the book that her argument. Her argument is that within the vita activa itself, what used to be the highest, namely action, and then work as that which action is what we do together. We act in concert, and in acting in concert, we build a common world that lasts and can change and is durable. But even as it changes, it is recognizable, and we can exercise our human freedom to build a world together that we share. In work, as we will see, we produce use objects and works of art that are stable and durable and give human life a home. In labor, we don't produce anything durable. We consume, and in consuming, we stay alive. And again, that laboring activity is part of the human condition since the beginning of collective mankind. Man has lived in a world in which they've had to labor. And in that world where they have to labor, they have necessities which they have to fulfill, and they often find that they resent and they want to overcome them. And they have done that through primarily three forms, right? Three ways: through enslavement, through servitude of others, and through the invention of tools that make their lives easier and their labor easier, and free them to then engage in things like work and action, which create a human, durable, and lasting and free world. So the overarching argument here is that labor is replacing action and work and is elevating it over them and becoming the dominant activity of mankind. We are going to be that what the emancipation of labor in the modern age and the modern world means is that one thing is good, right? There will be less violence and less oppression than in the past. At the same time, however, she says it's unlikely that there will be more freedom, and it's actually likely that there will be less freedom. And there are a number of reasons she gives for this, which are explored in the readings today. One is that freedom is generally something that is sought and attained through struggle and through overcoming of oppression. And if there's less oppression, there will be less freedom. There'll be a kind of equilibrium. And freedom happens in the great struggle against oppression and repression. And without and as oppression is lessened through the emancipation of labor, so is freedom. There will also be less freedom because laboring humanity, basically becomes consumption, consuming humanity. And in the consumption of things, all goods, even durable goods, and even actions become fleeting and become part of a waste economy. She's going to argue this is the culmination of this chapter. And as that happens, the very idea of creating a common world where we live in a world that lasts and is durable, where we can act and our actions are meaningful and can change the world, becomes problematic and into question. And so this is the fear she has. And so in the chapter on labor, on the one hand, the whole chapter is about how labor is and has been and is part of the human condition. At the same time, it's about how labor is becoming increasingly the the be all and end all, and in doing so, changing the human condition so that work and action have ever less meaning and importance in it. The two sections we're reading today really explore this. Section 16 is called The Instruments of Work and the Division of Labor. The argument here is that that labor produces nothing but consumables, right? It doesn't produce use objects or works that last. She has a critique of Marx here, in that Marx's socialized humanity, and the man in this social world would basically be freed from labor in order to pursue hobbies, but these hobbies have no common world. She says that the burden of biological life can be eliminated only by servants and by ancient slaves. Now she's going to talk about the third thing that can ease life in a second, which is tools and the use and the creation of tools. The basic argument here, though, is that we are increasingly being freed from labor and thus necessity, and that there's an enormous price paid for that. She says on page 120. On the one hand, the price paid for, trying to overcome the necessity of coercion is the violent injustice of coercing one part of humanity into darkness, pain, and necessity. And that can either be through slavery or through servitude or just wage employment at a very in sort of a incredibly oppressive and impressive way. This burden, she says, is natural and inherent in the human condition. We are all, in some sense, bound to necessity. And yet, when we try and free ourselves from it, we violently impose it on others. But we pay a price too, those of us who are the lords or the rich people, in that we lose a connection with one aspect of the human condition, namely the vivaciousness and the vitality of life and labor, in which we enjoy the toil of producing for ourselves. And so on 120, she can say, the human condition is such that pain and effort are not just symptoms which can be removed without changing life itself. So if we increasingly, through slavery, servitude, or tools, reduce the pain and effort of living, this will change life itself. Thus, the human condition, thus they are rather modes in which life itself, together with the necessity to which it is bound, makes itself felt. For mortals, the easy life of the gods would be a lifeless life. So one thing she's saying is that the more we free ourselves from labor, the more inhuman, in a way, we become. She then goes into what's the core of this chapter, which are the two ways in which we can free ourselves from labor in the modern world. The first is the use of tools and instruments. And she says this was the one that's of lesser importance. Although I want to flag for a second that the reason it's of lesser importance is because she thinks that it is impossible to create artificial intelligence. If one were able to create artificial intelligence, it's not clear that this would be of lesser importance. And so we want to flag that, and we can come back to it. The enormous improvement in tools, she says, makes life easier. It hides the curse of necessity. So the more tools we have, the less we feel the pain and toil of life. It makes slaves, and even to a certain extent, servants, unnecessary. And so one thing we want to flag here is that what Arendt is suggesting is that our superiority over ancients, and that we reject slavery and increasingly reject certain levels of servitude, do away with more and more oppression, is not actually a factor of our moral superiority. It's simply a factor of our technological superiority, such that we do not need slaves and servants as to the extent we did in order to free ourselves from the burden of life. But and as she said, and I already mentioned this, as we ease our life, we lose the struggle with necessity, and that means a kind of weakening of the urge to freedom, to be free from this necessity, and thus it weakens the drive to freedom. So that's the basic argument here in the section on tools. And she ends this section on tools by discussing the fact that there are limits on what tools can do. And the first limit is this idea that that tools cannot replace servants or slaves, those who are actually human and alive. And this is the argument against things like, we all have things like computers that make our lives easier, or artificial coffee makers, or whatever, but we still need some human beings to do the things that actually fulfill our needs. And she says that's because we can't have living things, alive machines or real artificial intelligence robots. If we could, that would change. And so I just flag that. But the more important principle in our laboring world, in our laboring process, is what she calls the division of labor. And the division of labor, she says, is not specialization. Specialization is guided by a product, a finished project, where I may be a specialist in glass blowing, and you may be a specialist in woodwork, and we don't do each other's work, but we're each doing our work in a specialized human way. But the division of labor actually presupposes what she calls the equivalence of all laborers. It's a qualitative equivalence of all single activities. So in anything we do, whether we're making glass or making woodwork, we don't actually have to have special skills. We just do the one little thing we need to do, and another person does another thing to do, and it's not really based on any kind of skill. And so what it does is it reduces all laborers to a kind of exchangeable parts of a whole process. And that this divided labor, she says, simply produces in order to be consumed. It's not, a woodworker is not making a beautiful thing that's going to last. It's making products that will be consumed. And there are no limits to this except our capacity to consume. And yet, as we become more and more wealthy, and we put money and store away money, we can consume almost an infinite amount of things. And so we increasingly divide labor. And so the problem of division of labor, the reason it's a real problem for her, is that it creates an overabundance. We create so much that we can't consume it all. And the solution, she says on page 124, is to treat all use objects as consumer goods. So whether it's a table, so the idea is that, labor used to produce things that were consumable: bread, food, things we need to stay alive. Whereas work in guilds or through skilled craftsmen produced things that, maybe we used, but lasted. But the more we have infinite wealth and abundance, we use up tables as fast as bread. We buy a table, we use it for 2 years, we throw it out in the trash, we leave it on the street. Maybe someone who's poor will come and pick it up, but it goes to the dump otherwise. And this is the rise of what she's going to call a waste economy. We transform objects into consumer goods. Work is transformed into laboring by a repetitive and automated process with infinitely quicker rhythm, and everything becomes a kind of waste. That's the premise of the chapter on division of labor. section 17 on a consumer society, which is really the culmination of this section on labor. Not only the last chapter, but I think the deep culmination of it starts with a claim that in a society of laborers, this is on 126, labor and consumption are part of the same process imposed by a hierarchy of necessity. So to say we live in a consumer society, say we live in a society of laborers. And it's a leveling of all human activities to secure the necessity of life. And now not only that, but to provide for abundance. She then asks a question that I think you should all think about. I think about it. I think it's a provocative question, which is there anything today that we do that's not in the realm of necessity, right? And it's a big question. Even, what she is going to say is that even the most powerful CEO or president or senator, when they're asked why they say it's my job. I'm doing it to make a living. We can ask if you think that's true or not. Who are we? She says, and who is the we? It's a question Bill has put into this group for the last few weeks or months. But her claim here is that we are people who increasingly see our main goal in life as making a living, as consuming, and that we set up an opposition between labor and play. All that is labor is what we do to make a living and consume, and anything that's not labor is play. And the only non-laborer left, she says, in the modern age is the artist. They're the only person who's allowed to play. Play in this sense is a kind of freedom. But she says it's a weak kind of freedom. It's a freedom that is irrelevant. It's not about building a world with others. It's not about acting to create things. It's about enjoying, so art becomes this sort of subjective self-expression. And an artist can play, but they're not actually, acting to impact the world as much as they are to express themselves and show their freedom to play. So playfulness becomes a source of freedom, and the artist dissolves into one who plays. And so on 128, she writes, the playfulness of the artist is felt to fulfill the same function in the laboring life process of society as the playing of tennis or the pursuit of a hobby fulfills in the life of the individual. So in an individual, playing tennis or pursuing a hobby gives us a sense of freedom, but a self-freedom, a kind of subjective, it's what we do when we're not earning a living so that we can consume. I'll just do a quick derivation for you. The word hobby comes from the idea of a hobby horse, which was a horse that was kept ready, a light nag that they kept ready in case of invasion, that they could ride up and down to alert people, actually like Paul Revere did, to an invasion. And from this hobby horse that was ridden back and forth up and down to alert people came the expression to ride one's hobby horse, which meant to follow a favorite pastime. And that's the source of the modern term. The emancipation of labor for Arendt means less oppression, but not more freedom. And here you'll notice a confluence between Arendt's thinking and the thinking of Steven Pinker, who argues that violence is being reduced in the modern age and oppression is being reduced. Again, something that we can talk about. We talk a lot about violence and oppression today, but increasingly not about physical violence so much as linguistic violence or social or symbolic violence. Pinker and Arendt would say that means less oppression, but it doesn't mean more freedom. And the danger, she says, is that emancipation of labor will force all of mankind under a yoke of necessity. Why? Because as we become more emancipated and less oppressed, we will, what we seek is not freedom, but happiness. We seek a kind of happiness of the greatest number. And so the goal of human life ceases to be freedom as the activity that we engage in collectively with others to build a common world, and becomes simply, how do we provide people with enough consumables and enough freedom from oppression that they are well-fed, entertained, and happy. And this is the dream of a true consumer society, which she says it's an ideal of a present and not an existing reality. This is what she thinks Marx's, in a sense, utopian vision is, that we will emancipate men from necessity and make the animal laborans productive, so that they can pursue play and hobbies when they don't have to labor to keep themselves alive. But she says this is based on a fallacy that we now can tell, that the fallacy is that when men are done laboring to keep themselves alive, they will nourish higher activities. They will actually nourish hobbies, but also actions and engagement in public life that matter. And on 133, she says, we now know this is a fallacy. The spare time of the animal laborans is never spent in anything but consumption, and the more time left to him, the greedier and more craving his appetites. This is a very negative or a very pessimistic account of who we are and who we've become. Basically, the argument is that in this mass culture of reduced oppression, we care not about freedom, but about happiness. And the paradox is that we are the most unhappy of people. Because, and she says that because we are never satisfied with our ability to consume, we have to labor ever more and more. And there's simply no way to overcome our demands for increased consumption. And what this leads to, aside from our own unhappiness, is a waste economy that in which things must be devoured and discarded as quickly as they appear so that we can consume more. And that leads to an increasing rejection of the common world. We lose the ability, she says, to recognize our futility, the futility of a life which does not fix or realize itself in any permanent subject which endures after its labor is past. It is now futile for us to build a meaningful world, and all we seek is happiness that we cannot achieve through a kind of abundance and consumption, and we can't even recognize that. And that's where she leaves us at the end of this chapter on labor. It's a pretty harrowing reading. I'm sure there will be pushback against it. I think there should be, but that's how I understand the labor section, the labor chapter, which is the first sort of chapter on the vita activa in this book. So with that said, I see there's already a bunch of questions. I think most of you are well versed in this. You can ask a question by using the hand raise function under the participants tab. There's also a chat, which you can follow, where people can talk amongst themselves. And sometimes people will raise issues from the chat to bring to my attention. So I always appreciate that. So that said, let's begin. And Stephen, you're first.
Thanks, Roger, for your exposition. I think you've already perhaps answered my question. It was about page 129 and her sweeping assertion about the modern age has meant progress towards non-violence. I can see that in the terms that she describes a little later in that paragraph. about the arts of war and piracy and all of that sort of thing. But what occurred to me when I read it was what you had just mentioned a moment ago, that the modern forms of violence in the industrial world, say, are not explicit and physical. I'm thinking of the attempt to intimidate workers from unionizing at Amazon and other places like that. And I wonder if Arendt would consent to allowing her term violence to cover these other sorts of sort of lighter weight intimidation, but very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a widespread argument that touches many parts of our world, including the culture wars, and I know it's going to be controversial. But Steven Pinker has made this argument, right, that we are living in a world of decreasing violence, and some people oppose him, and he's tried to make it fairly objectively. What Arendt says is that we have the actual decrease is on the bottom of 129 into 130, an actual decrease in the use of instruments of violence in human affairs generally. She thinks this is true even with the rise of things like nuclear weapons and ever more intense machineries of violence. What you use the example of union busting or others. There certainly is still oppression. She's not going to argue there's not, and there's certainly power, and there's certainly strength. What she's saying here is that violence is being reduced, and she says it is as though the growing elimination of violence throughout the modern age almost automatically opened the doors for the re-entry of necessity on its most elementary level. And her argument for this is the Roman Empire, that as we sort of free people from violence of slavery and servitude and make everybody a laborer, everybody becomes equally a free man. And that's good. It's less oppression. But in so doing, we lose the push to emancipate ourselves from oppression. I think if you think about the modern phrase, if one person is not free, then nobody is free. I think that in very many ways sums up what Arendt thinks is the modern account, that we think that we're all equally unfree. We're all, and another way of putting that is we're all equally laborers, and or consumers, however you want to put it in her terms. And in such a world, you lose the impetus for freedom as she presents it. Is that helpful, Stephen, or do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I don't think I want to follow up. I want to think about that for a while, Roger. I guess everybody might be a laborer, but the level of freedom that a laborer seeks is still worthy of fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, clearly some people are going to be, more oppressed in a laboring society than others, right? I mean, I don't think I or she is arguing that. But what she says is, insofar as everybody identifies as a laborer, right? This comes back to what I said earlier. Do we agree with her claim that today almost everybody thinks that what they do is about making a living? It's almost a kind of arrogance to say, I don't, work for a living today. I do it because I love it, or I do it for other reasons. I mean, some people say that, and I think many of us probably believe it. But but what she says is that that's almost a kind of like aristocratic throwback, and we're embarrassed, at least in certain company, to say such a thing. Again, I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but I think that's her point, and I think there's a certain amount of truth to it. And so that's what she's talking about here.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Dina, you're next.
Hi, I have two questions. One is based on the text, and the other one is a little broader. The textual question is, I noticed what struck me as a bit of an oddity, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about it. On page 126, she says that the emancipation of the laboring activity preceded the emancipation of the laborers. But on 129, she says that they were concomitant. And
Can you say where on 100, where on a, oh, I see, the
120.
emancipation of labor and the concomitant emancipation of the laboring classes from oppression and
then
exploitation.
and in the German, the contrast is even stronger. She says on page 150 in the German, similarly as she did on page 126 in the English, that the emancipation of the laboring activity ist die Befreiung der Arbeitstätigkeit selbst ist einige Jahrhunderte älter als die Arbeiteremanzipation. So that's what she says in the English. But on page 153, she says that the Befreiung actually gefolgt war, so it followed. That, and it's a real inconsistency, frankly.
Well, the Befreiung befolgt, I just be very clear what the Befreiung is. Could the Befreiung be the emancipation of the laborer? Or
no, the emancipation, it says in German on the page 153, die Emanzipation der Arbeit, da sie von der Emanzipation der Arbeiterklassen, ihrer Befreiung zur Unterdrückung und Ausbeutung gefolgt war, ist zweifellos fortschrittlich. So there's, in both English and the German, there is an inconsistency I was wondering about. And my second question is unrelated, but and a broader one, which is, obviously the book is expressly about the human condition, at least in the English, but throughout Arendt refers to what is natural and inherent in the human condition. So I'm wondering, isn't that in effect speaking about the what is human nature, even though it is one step removed? In today's reading, we saw it on page 119 that you briefly referenced, that enslavement is inherent to the human condition. But this idea of there being things inherent to the human condition is really throughout the book. And it even ends, chapter 2, for example, ends with the very last paragraph ends with the suggestion that what is divided into public and private corresponds to the nature of these activities themselves, so that there's something inherent in these activities that makes them one or the other. And but again,
where is that on at the end of chapter 2? Where is that?
Page 78. But I mean, I'm just referring to generally, comes up. Yeah. I've got various places where it happens, but in today's reading, it's on 119. This idea that enslavement is inherent to the human condition. So the question really is, okay, she doesn't talk about human nature, but is speaking about what is inherent to the human condition, in effect, a way to speak about human nature.
So let me deal with the, I think, easier question, the second one first. I don't think inherent means natural, right? It inheres in it. The human condition is something she thinks that is. I'm going to say that somewhat carefully because I'm not sure I've formulated it before. But the human condition is the condition in which humans live in a world, and it's a world that she thinks has been developing and growing, since the beginning of human life. And what is the beginning of human life? Not natural life, but human life as it emerged in a kind of political collective existence. And there that human condition is, but need not be. It can change. So, you know, when she says on I guess on page what was it, 120, 131, right? That is this where she says slavery is inherent? No. Where's when she says slavery,
119.
119, when she says slavery is inherent in the human condition. She says the fact that slavery and banishment into the household was by and large the social condition of all laborers prior to the modern age is primarily due to the human condition itself. Life, which for all other animal species is the very essence of their being, becomes a burden to man because of his innate repugnance to futility. Now, what is man's innate repugnance to futility? It's not a natural thing, but it's part of his humanity insofar as he's part of the human condition. The burden is all the heavier since none of the so-called loftier desires has the same urgency, is actually forced upon man by necessity as the elementary needs of life. Slavery becomes the social condition of the laboring classes because it was felt that it was the natural condition of life itself. So when she says, okay, when she says it was felt that it was the natural condition of life itself, that doesn't mean she's saying it is a natural condition, but it was felt by people who had an urge to live a life that was higher than that. And they associated slavery and labor with animals, with things of nature. And so I think she's fairly consistent on that. I don't think that I believe she's fairly consistent on that. I'm happy to have you. Yeah, let me say, do you still have an issue with that?
No, I wasn't trying to ascribe some type of naturalism to her. I think she's I agree with you. She's completely consistent that that's not her intention. But there does seem to be something that she considers quote unquote inherent, or in German, in the Natur der Sache, that is unique to the human condition, as if it were an essence that is unchangeable. And that type of language repeats itself throughout.
Yeah, I don't see that. If there is one thing she will, I think, so let me revise that. If there's one thing that I think she thinks is potentially natural to the human condition, it's the capacity to act and the fact that we are born as acting beings, or what she'll call natality, natal beings who can start things anew and be free and create new worlds, and thus create a world which is not natural, but is artificial. That's to her the one sort of natural aspect of humans that distinguishes humans from other animals, and separates us from mere species life of animal life. And in doing so, we have that capacity. The human condition in which we've built is one that our natality and acting together has built a world in which we see our mere being alive as something that associates us with animals, and that we have a kind of repugnance to it because we want to be more than that. So that what's I guess natural is the capacity to act and build an artificial world. The world we've built is not natural. It's contingent, and one that is the condition that we're now born into, or the world that conditions us that we're born into. Your first question, which is a great question and one that I have not looked at before, is one that may take me a bit of time to unpack. So let me just look at it again. So on page 126, the beginning of a consumer society, she writes, "It is frequently said that we live in a consumer's society. And since, as we saw, labor and consumption are but two stages of the same process imposed upon man by the necessity of life, namely, we labor to consume, which is the way it usually is, although she's now going to argue that it's changed. We now consume to consume, and labor is almost drops out of the picture. This is only another way of saying that we live in a society of laborers or a society of consumers. This society did not come about through the emancipation of the laboring classes, but by the emancipation of the laboring activity itself, which preceded by centuries the political emancipation of laborers. The point is not that for the first time in history, laborers were admitted and given equal rights in the public realm. That's the political emancipation of laborers, but that we have almost succeeded in leveling all human activities to the common denominator of securing the necessities of life and providing for their abundance. So what she's arguing is that the emancipation of the activity of labor emerges back with the rise of utilitarianism, or the principle of happiness, and the idea that we simply want to live a happy life, which she thinks, began with people like Bentham and Mill, and long before, we actually have a labor movement that emancipates the laborers. Now, the other quotation you gave, can you remind me what page it was?
Yeah, 129, the first full paragraph.
Right. So emancipation of labor and the concomitant emancipation of the laboring classes from oppression and exploitation certainly meant progress in the direction of non-violence.
And the contrast is even greater in the German, as I pointed out.
Yeah, it is. But here she's talking about the progress in the direction of nonviolence. But okay, it is much less certain that it is also progress in the direction of freedom. No man exerted. So where did she say?
Well, the one I don't want to
the concomitant. That's so
concomitant versus preceding. I mean,
yeah. This is a good point, and I don't have the German in front of me, and I'm sorry. Maybe if you put it in the chat, that would actually help me. But
okay,
at least in the English, I don't see this as a contradiction so much. I mean, I think I see why you're saying it in the German. I think what she's saying is, at some point, the emancipation of labor and the emancipation of the laboring classes from oppression, it suggests here that the emancipation of labor precedes the emancipation of the laboring classes from expression, right? I mean, she's saying along with it, and what follows it is the emancipation of the laboring classes. So I would say that is consistent, I think, unless I'm misreading it.
Well, I don't want to keep everyone up for this, but I find it interesting that 126, it preceded by hundreds of years, by centuries,
right.
Not just a little bit. And then all of a sudden it's concomitant. And in the German, it's definitely before and after. It's odd. It's all that I wanted.
Can you put the German in the chat, Dina?
Sure, I'll do that. Yeah.
I just because I think in concomitant she's using it. It doesn't have to be like temporal in the sense. I think she's simply saying that these things both happen. But I understand that it could be confusing. But if it's, and I'd like to see the German. And I'll come once you do, maybe alert me to it, someone, and I'll come back to it. Is that all right? Okay. Thank you. I think I like that's really great close reading. And unfortunately, I'm away from home right now, and I don't have my German text with me, so I didn't read the German this week. So I appreciate your pointing that out. David.
Hi. Thanks as ever. I found this chapter very interesting, and but also it is very difficult in parts. And I will conclude just by asking you to explain a little bit of it. I've struggled with and don't understand. But a few comments. I was very interested in what she said. I mean, it's a kind of side argument in a way, but as often great writers do, they say something in a footnote as a sort of throwaway remark that someone, that someone like me would immediately pick up as being very profound. Because as a analyst and psychiatrist, what she remarks about drug addiction is a remarkable comment, that the addiction is to the relief of pain.
Yeah.
It's framed within a general argument about, which Freud was also very struggled with. Is pleasure a thing in itself, or is it the release from pain? And I just thought her argument about that was very interesting.
What page is it on, David?
Oh, I shall tell you.
I mean, she makes this
page 113.
113.
Yeah,
that's earlier. That's
Oh right, I was reading the earlier bit. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, we talked about this, I think, a little last week, but okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I missed that. Okay, so then I also think what she says about happiness is interesting, because I don't know where I read this. You might know, or whether it's something I've constructed from somewhere. But the idea that happiness can never be an aim in life. It's a kind of side effect of a life well lived. But we could say that under the conditions of the consumer society in which we live, the illusion of happiness as something to aim for, particularly through consumption, is constantly held out to us. The other thing I just wanted to ask or say really was, what seems to be, she talks about abundance without talking about the motive for abundance. And it seems you can't talk about the motive of abundance without having a conception of the world in which we live. And that is capitalism and commodity structure. So it's necessary, it's a motor for capitalism. Some of the political economists say that capitalism cannot survive unless there's a 2% growth rate. So there has to be a constant maintenance of the rate of profit. And because of that, I think there's a constant, which I think Arendt would agree with, it's just why she doesn't talk about it. The use value is triumphed over by exchange value. So the thing that produces abundance is the necessity to constantly produce commodities which cannot last. They have to be consumed and disappear. And there's a constant escalation of the commodity, and I would say a penetration of the commodity form into our very life and soul, so that we cannot even conceive of ourselves as without a kind of, that we are a commodity. We are an embodiment of labor power or whatever, and all we can do is work for a living. So I'm just a bit surprised that she doesn't talk more about what is the motor. I mean, I know she disagrees with Marx on loads of things, but she doesn't only disagree with him. She's also regards him as a very great enemy, if you like, a man with a great mind. And I'm surprised she doesn't look at the commodification and the need to maintain the rate of profit in terms of abundance as part of our degradation. My last thing is just to ask you what this, if I can just ask you what something means, because I couldn't really follow it, although I tried. It's on page 132. And it's the first paragraph, the second half, the danger of future automation, and so on. I didn't really understand that paragraph. The rhythm of machines will magnify and intensify the natural rhythm of life enormously. I think that's where I got stuck. But it would not change it, only make it more deadly. So I'd be grateful if you'd explain that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay. Let me start with the last one just so I don't forget it. And I'm probably going to leave the pain one simply because we talked about that last week, and you can go back and watch it if you want. I had to, because they're great questions, but there's so much I want to be able to do justice to your main question and have time for others. So the last one you asked, the danger of future automation is less the much deplored mechanization and artificialization of natural life than that it's artificiality notwithstanding, all human productivity would be sucked into an enormously intensified life process and would follow automatically without pain or effort its ever recurrent natural cycle. The rhythm of machines would magnify and intensify the natural rhythm of life enormously, but it would not change, only make more deadly life's character with respect to the world, which is to wear down durability. I just have to remind myself where we are in the chapter this is on. So the danger of future automation is less mechanization and artificialization of life than, right, that all human productivity is sucked into an enormously intensified life process. It's to turn man and all human activity into this, what she's calling, what's it called? The division of labor, into a kind of a constant producing of consumer goods that we consume in an ever recurrent cycle. And she says the rhythm of machines would magnify and intensify this life process where we constantly labor and consume. But it would not change, only make more deadly life's character with respect to the world, which is to wear down its durability. So the point is that life is in contrast to homo faber, or work, which creates durable things in the world. And what she's saying is the massive changes that the division of labor and the rhythm of machines and the oneness of labor and the reduction of all people to, sort of just people on an assembly line, it doesn't actually change the basic idea of labor, which is that it's about life and which is against the durability of the world, but it makes it more deadly in the sense that it intensifies it so much that the world becomes almost unsustainable. I think that's the argument here. The bigger question and the great question, I think, that you asked is about the motor for abundance. And you ask why she doesn't name capitalism, right? I mean, I think it's a perfectly fair question. And I think there's an answer for it. And I think the answer, which I know you and I have discussed a few times over the years that you've been in this group on and off, is that for her, capitalism is not the motor for this. In fact, as she says here, the same thing befalls communism. Her argument here is that where this ends is seen by Marx's utopia. And so what's the motor? It's not the profit motive, right? Which it's, we have to ask ourselves, what is a definition of capitalism? But it's not the profit motive. It's, for her, the motive, the underlying principle is the principle of life, which she then thinks is even superseded by, or the principle of happiness, which is then even superseded by the principle of life. And that we're going to not get there until the end, but that's a quote from page 311, the second to last chapter of the book, where she's talking about this in a way that you need to understand in order to understand this chapter. So unfortunately, I'm bringing that in from the end. But the point is that the motor that leads to this consumption is the elevation of life and thus consumption and happiness above all other higher ends. And that, she thinks, is as true for Marx's communism and even Lenin's communism, or any real communism, as it is for capitalism and as it is for welfare states. I think the sort of quote unquote materialist argument she's going to make, David, is that the elevation of life and consumption happens in all modern societies, be they capitalist, welfare state, or communist. That's the materialist claim, right? The then superstructure or idealist claim is that they are all driven by a reversal in the vita activa, such that our concern for public life and a common world is overtaken by our concern for happiness and consumption and life. So you want to respond to that? You have to unmute yourself if you do. Yeah.
Well, no, thanks very much. Just to say, many people would say that, for example, Russia was state capitalism in the form that it took, and that we've not really seen communism, maybe never will. But in a way, I don't think that matters, because
she's not arguing about Russia necessarily, although that's part of it. She's also arguing about Marx. She's saying the utopia of Marx is one in which we all become socialized, and that we are reduced to our private lives and maybe our hobbies, but not engaged in a public world. I mean, that's what she thinks is Marx's utopia. So
I think one can ignore that utopian version of Marx. I mean, we can argue about it, but even if it were true, I think one can ignore it and stick to his understanding of the political economy of capitalism, and his understanding of the distinction between exchange value and use value, and the transformation of objects into commodities, and the way that form, the commodity form, penetrates into human life. A good example for me, of course, would be health. Health should not be a commodity. Health should not be something that's for sale. And it isn't, of course, in Britain. But, well, it is, but we have a National Health Service. So I think that belief in the commodity form, you can take away from all the utopian stuff and just ask the question, why? It could be true that in communism as well, or whatever, but within the world that we know, how do we understand the constant overproduction of commodities which have no use, and their built-in expiry date? They're constant in order to maintain profit. I think that's unarguable. And even if what she says is true, this would add an acceleration to it. But I'll step out now. But thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I know two things. One is, I would basically argue with you that there's almost no place left where health is seen simply as, where health is not seen as something that should be widely available. There's simply questions of differences of how much to give. And, we don't live in a world in which anywhere that I know of, there's not some sort of welfare state socialized healthcare. There's a question of degree and other stuff, but I think the drive to make health and not only health, but consumption through welfare or unemployment or whatever, universally a universal capacity is part and parcel of the modern age. And I think the virtue of Arendt's account is that she sees both capitalism, the welfare state, and communism as participating in the same motor. The detriment or the negative or the weakness of her account from your point of view is that within this overarching trend, she doesn't make enough distinctions, right? She doesn't make the distinctions you'd like to make about, you know, in your view, the important the quality, the quantity, or the extent of happiness that should be granted to everyone. And you're right, she doesn't make those distinctions. She thinks in her, and all, you know, in her somewhat ethereal, looking down from the God's way, which is her way of thinking, those are technical questions that other people can work out, right? She's, you know, she says, look, I understand the big stuff. I'll let you guys work out the little stuff. That's, I think, her approach, with its strengths and its weaknesses. So it's as much as I.
Thanks very much, Roger, and thank you for your generosity, really, in engaging with all this with me again. Thank you.
My pleasure. I think it's a great question, and I think it's important questions in her work. Let me just have it take a second to read the German that Dina posted, so I at least can. Die Emanzipation der Arbeit, das sie von der Emanzipation der Arbeiterklasse, ihre Befreiung von Unterdrückung und Ausbeutung erfolgt war, ist zweifellos fortschrittlich. Wenn wir dann Fortschritt an der Abnahme von Gewalttätigkeit. Yeah, I mean, it's followed by the emancipation of the working class, emancipation of work, as it was followed by the emancipation of Arbeit. Yeah. I will hear, I think she's saying the that first came the emancipation of work, and then came the emancipation of the Arbeiter classes, right? So I'm not sure what the distinction is, Dina. Maybe my German is not good enough to understand this. I mean, she's still saying that the emancipation of work came before the emancipation of the working classes. Am I missing it?
Yes, but I don't want to keep everyone up, and I think so. You might on 153 she says it follows, gefolgt war.
But that's different, right? So first she says, in the first part of the sentence, what she says is the same as what she said earlier, that first comes the emancipation of work, and then the emancipation of the Arbeiter classes. Right?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, no, she clearly says on 153 that it follows. So it's interesting in terms of the discussion we just had vis-a-vis Marx. And of course, what comes first, the emancipation of labor as opposed to the emancipation of the labor force, or the workers, obviously, or the laborer, I should say, is obviously highly relevant to the discussion about Marx. And I think there's just an incongruity. Let's call it an incongruity in the text. It's less so in the English, but it's quite stark in the German.
All right, I'd love to talk to you about it, because I mean, I really, it says the
but I don't. But we have so much. So I'm sure there's so
Okay.
many questions, and it's not
All right.
that important.
No, I know, but I just want to make sure I understand it. Maybe you and I can talk about it later, because my reading of the German says that the emancipation of labor was followed by the emancipation of the laboring classes. But I guess you're a German speaker, so I'm going to defer to you. I just want to make sure I understand it. How?
No, yeah, my question in this is about Arendt in this chapter kind of almost refers to late consumerism as something which is and throughout the entire labor process as almost part of this like metabolic process, that it's this life process which basically we incorporate this way of life, this labor into basically everything, that everything becomes labor because everything becomes a consumer product. So everything's kind of laborized in that way. And this is kind of breaking down the idea of the common world. And one thing that, of course, comes to mind today is that consumerism is trashing the planet. And Arendt, in her conception of the creation of the common world, does discuss the physical creation of, via work, all these things like tables and such like that, or the creation of the common world in the sense of action, the stories we tell and such things. But isn't there also one thing that I'm not sure if she certainly doesn't get into it this, she may get into it more in future works, but to what extent is the common world something which we preserve, i.e. the environment, if we have like a public park or something like that, or even just literally on the level of trashing the planet so future generations still have something to live on?
Mm-hmm. Um, it's a good question, Hal. You know, it relates somewhat to her distinction between earth and world alienation, which we've talked a little bit about, and we'll talk more about when we get into the chapter on Vita Activa in the modern age. But you know, when she says that on, you know, back all the way back in the prologue, right, which we read you know, on day one, the earth is the very quintessence of the human condition, and earthly nature, for all we know, may be unique in the universe in providing human beings with a habitat in which they can move and breathe without effort and artifice. So, you know, the earth for her is human, in the sense that it is what we are born into, and it's a habitat that we can live in without artifice. But the human artifice of the world, that which we create, separates humans from all mere animals. So from her point of view, this sort of earthly environment that we live in, and that allows us to live without artifice, is part of the very quintessence of the human condition as it's emerged, because part of human life is that we also live absent artifice, that there's parts of our life, our environment, the earth, fortune, chance, all of that is part of what it means to be human, as part of the human condition. And what she's saying, I'm just going to mute everyone again so we get some quiet. What she's saying is that as the animal laborans becomes dominant and we live in a world of consumption, we increasingly cease to be engaged in the building of artificial worlds through intentional action and freedom. And, you know, if you want to take it in the direction I think you're taking it, we instead simply consume and dispose of waste, and in a way that may actually threaten the earth, which is a quintessence of the human condition. That's one way to think this through. The other is on page 10, right, where she talks about the difference between human nature and the human condition. She talks about the most radical change in the human condition we can imagine would be an emigration of men from Earth to some other planet. Such an event, no longer totally impossible, would imply that man would have to live under man-made conditions, radically different from those the Earth offers him. Neither labor nor work nor action, indeed thought as we know it, would make sense any longer. Namely, if we fundamentally create an artificial environment, whether on another planet or even on Earth, if we sort of make everything, including humans, artificial, we would become different kinds of beings who wouldn't need to labor, work, or act, or even think. We would, in a sense, almost become computers or driven by computers. anyway, all of this is to say that, yeah, I mean, I think she takes the earth and earthliness as a deeply important aspect of what it means to be human, or has meant to be human within the human condition, and one that we could destroy. And it's very possible, and if we do, we may live in a completely artificial environment that would make us very different kind of humans. So yeah, I think again, think about what we're doing. It's not she's not here saying therefore we should all be environmentalists, right? But she is saying so the earth is a big part of what it means to be human. And I guess, and if you want to take it, if you destroy the earth, you destroy that part of being human. Is that all right, Hal? Or you follow up? Or
Yeah, no, I think so. I do know in I believe, I forget which one, it's in the Home to Roost essay. I forget what collection that's in. She does reference how people are slowly becoming more aware of how they're destroying the environment and how she welcomes that as something. So she definitely engaged with the problem later in her life, especially. I was just wondering, because on one hand, she seems to treat the leveling of activity kind of to this very metabolic style living of consumerism, which, and then she also seems to, in a sense, devalue the natural in that sense, and it's at least doesn't consider it human. Maybe she doesn't consider that a devaluation. Maybe that's my own humanism biasing me, but I'm just thinking of that in lines with the idea, okay, creating and maintaining a common world today would surely, to a certain extent, have to include the ability of human beings to live on the earth and have the ability to continue to live.
well, I think she would agree with you. I mean, I think in both the end of this book, we'll get there I think in the penultimate chapter of this book, or the ultimate chapter, and in her essay on the conquest of space, her real dystopia is that eventually man will have to abandon the earth and live on a spaceship or on another planet that's fully artificially constructed. That's the dystopia that sort of underlines much of what she's doing and thinking here. And she thinks that's the direction we're headed in. So yeah. And I mean, I think her comments on the waste society here are prescient along these regards. Amanda. Amanda, are you there? You have to unmute yourself. Is Amanda still here?
Hello?
Hi.
Yes, you can hear me? Hi.
Yep.
Okay. My question has to do about freedom and understanding that better in the context of this book. And so I was hoping if you could define a bit better what freedom looks like and how we're reading it here.
Okay, great. Welcome, by the way. I don't know if this is your first time or first question.
I'm first question, first group virtual reading, and very happy to be here. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Welcome to have you. Nice to have you. So in general for Arendt, freedom is the capacity to act in concert. What that means is it's not freedom, it's not free will in the sort of philosophical sense that I can raise my hand or throw my pen up and down or whatever it is. Freedom is a political idea for her, or if you don't want to use political, it's public or common. But it's the human capacity to act with others in concert in ways that matter in the world. And so she will say that the only truly human right is not a right to be alive or to be kept alive because we all will die. And it's not a right to medical care because, at some point we're going to die. There's a limit to what we can do for ourselves. And it's not even, and actually dying well as a martyr or or just as an ethical way can actually be a deeply human activity for her. The only truly human right is the right to act and speak in public in ways that matter. It's the right to be free. It's the right to freely act and speak, and act and speak go together for her, in public. That means so that other people can see and respond to you, and therefore that your action matters. That's what freedom is for her. So to the extent she says in these chapters that freedom needs, in a sense, necessity to struggle against, I need some sort of oppression. What she's saying is that to really enter the public world, and the public world, to enter the public world for her is always dangerous, because if you say something and act in public, people may hate you and they may kill you, like they did to Socrates or Jesus or others. And those are the examples of free people that she has in mind. And so it takes a great courage to leave the comfort of your private or social worlds and insert your opinions and your actions into the public worlds for others to judge them. And for her, what encourages us to do that, the motor, to use the word we talked about with David earlier, is to some extent a repulsion against oppression and life and our toil of the world, and a seeking for something higher, a seeking to build something that matters or is meaningful. And so, I have said a number of times in this group that the two ideas that most, to me, are most important in all of Hannah Arendt's work are freedom and meaningfulness, and they go together. Freedom is the capacity to act and speak in concert in ways that matter. And what it means to speak in ways that matter is to speak and act in order to bring meaning to the world, to create stories and institutions that make human life more than simply staying alive, to create meaning in the world. And so freedom is that activity. And while all animals have the ability to live and work, and even maybe create things that last, right? I mean, they build houses that last or whatever. It's only humans, excuse me, in her telling, and we can have arguments about this as well with, zoologists and others, but it's only humans who use their freedom to make meaningful worlds. And that's at the core of what it means to be free for Arendt.
Okay, thank you.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, it's helpful to clarify.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Roberto, you're next.
Hi, thank you, Roger. Thank you for your exposition. My question is related with precisely with what the question was Amanda about freedom and your explanation, because struck to me on page 119, Hannah Arendt said that the burden of biological life, wedging down and consuming the specifically human lifespan between birth and death, can be eliminated only by the use of servants.
Mm-hmm.
And the chief function of ancient slave was rather to carry the burden of consumption in the household than to produce for society at large. I'm struck by this statement because in a way that it seems to be, I don't know if I missed something, but it seems to be that the slave and servitude is a precondition for freedom. That's at least in the ancient Greeks, as she present this statement. So is a kind of there is one thing related to the consumption also. In the city state, the slavery and servitude, allows the rest of society to be free on speech and action, because they are taking the burden of necessity in the household, and this is why they are, banished into the households, as to let the social and the political war to become alive, to become free speech. I don't know if you get my question, or even my concern with this statement.
I think I get it. And so if I understand it, you're saying that she says that servants and in ancient times slaves were a precondition for freedom.
Yeah.
And and what else? All I will add to that. I'll explain it a little further. Well, so first, let me explain what she means by that, which I think you said right, which is that if you want to be free, you need to have some time in which you can reflect in private on who you are and what's meaningful to you, and then either create works that express that or engage in actions that articulate that in the world. And that requires time, which in Greek, the word was skole, right? A kind of leisure, but not leisure in the sense of just free time to waste, but time to actually think and act. And so there's a need to be freed from absolute necessity. What she's saying in these chapters is that there are at least three ways to free ourselves from that necessity. And I mean, I'll even suggest four, but we can argue about that. One are slaves, two are servants, three are tools, technology, right? And four would be a kind of complete artificial intelligence, where all machines ran themselves and freed all of us to have time. I said something earlier that I guess I expected to be a bit provocative, which is to say that she doesn't, in an important way, the modern repugnance to slavery is less a moral than a technological achievement. That there's always a need to have for people who are able and powerful and whatever enough to free themselves from that necessity in order to pursue higher ends. And what allows us today to think that slavery is so awful is that we have other means of achieving that through servitude or technology. And so, yeah, I mean, she sees that need as deeply part of the human condition. But she thinks it's good that we've no longer need to pay the price of slavery, which she says is enormous, and partly consisted in the violent injustice of forcing one part of humanity into the darkness of pain and necessity, further down on 119. So, I think she sees, in one sense, the rise of technology as a positive, in that it enables us to overcome slavery and the worst kind of servitude. And it allows more and more people, emancipation of labor, to use technology to free themselves, to have more time. Um, uh, but that's not, the only thing that it does. It also, in reducing oppression, weakens the impulse to freedom. And then as we replace freedom with evaluation of life over all else, we lead to this consumer/waste society. So that's the argument. Is that answer? Did I understand it and answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's clear. It lets us the remain question, the remain paradox, if is that the liberation of a slavery led us, in a war with all of us as a kind of under the necessity, because we take the role of consumption. We take as a whole the function of consumption to maintain this life process. This is the paradox, I think, is remain in the modern age.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to go on because I see there's actually now suddenly a lot of questions and not that much time. So we're going to try and move a little quicker. Vivian. Hello.
Oh, hi. So I just want to make one or two comments, but I want to end the comment with a question, which I'll just state here first. Actually, the question is: we've defined a lot of things, but perhaps we should define more what is meant by the word happiness, because, for example, to what extent does Arendt say or imply that happiness is gratification, etc., etc. But my comments are not that technical, because I'm no specialist, but in response to listening to the language that she uses, the language that we use in understanding or in reading Arendt, I'm just struck again, and forgive me because this might irritate you. I'm struck again by how different thinkers. It's not that they say the same thing; it's that, in a sense, they have the moral compass in the broadest sense is shared. So here I'm thinking, and here's the part that might irritate you, I'm thinking again of Adorno and how many things you have said this time in terms of Scole and leisure, and Adorno's discussion of commodification, objectification in his Minima Moralia, and he addresses very specifically this part about leisure time. And I got into a lot of trouble last time, probably by using the word degrade, but I'm going to use it again, since Arendt definitely, as did Adorno for that matter, take, I think it's fair to say, that dim view of our futility in our futility in the face of struggling to make meaning and enduring and substantive things in our lives and in the world. I think that I've gotten a little lost here. Hang on a second. That even though perhaps on the face of things and on the surface, she might actually say things that look controversial. In fact, I think not really so. I understand why some of the things sound or look controversial, but basically I'm so awed and struck every time I'm confronted with Arendt and her thinking, not so much always her writing, but her thinking. I'm so struck by what and this is a good day to say this on because it's Good Friday, what an absolutely quintessential literate Jew Arendt is, in the sense of speaking the wisdom of the ages. And I just want to illustrate this with, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the astonishing quilts of G's Bend that date back to maybe the late 50s and the 60s, that were produced by impoverished descendants of slaves, women in the South. And to call them quilts is absurd, because I mean they are quilts, but they stand as objects, as things that have been made next to the most among the most incredible art objects that exist, and sort of as very grand abstract paintings. But one of when I first saw years and years ago an exhibition of the quilts of G's Bend, one of the women, and this was a really old video, said, we was poor, we had nothing and they had nothing. Now we have things, we have TVs, we have wash machines, ain't nobody happy anymore. And I'm just struck by, this is what I mean by the, wisdom of the ages, and back to the Talmud, and I'm no Talmudic scholar, but this and her, I think her wisdom, and just like the woman in G's Bend, expresses all of this in this tradition.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Vivian. I think there is a lot of wisdom in Arendt and the wisdom of the ages, as you put it. There's a famous anecdote told similarly to the one you just told, where at the end of after World War II, a number of the Jewish resistance fighters and others, and even Jewish survivors who came out of the camps, are reported to have said, that they don't know why to live anymore. In the camps, they had a reason to live, and in the resistance, they had reason to fight. But in the post-war era, there's a sense of why, what's it all about. And again, this is not to say we should all go back to being poor or to being inmates in concentration camps. But Arendt is always driven by this question of meaning. And it's a question that almost doesn't work today, insofar as we are increasingly living in a society in which what we aim for and need is happiness. I'll get to that in a second. I mean, I don't know how many of you read the newsletter that goes out every Thursday and Sunday, the Amor Mundi newsletter, but I did link this week to an essay about the humanities and the crisis of the humanities. And the reason I linked to it is because there was a one part of it that I thought was quite interesting, where the woman who wrote it, I think her name was, I always get these wrong and then your people get mad at me. I think it's Sarah Cedarson or something along those lines. Who I think she's a PhD student somewhere, talked about how the humanities as a national project, which it originally was about telling the stories and narratives of the meaning and soulfulness of a nation and of a people. And that the crisis of the humanities is that we can no longer talk about soulfulness and the soul. What we talk about now is utility and happiness, and largely science and technology. And I think there was a lot of truth to that statement. And that's the main reason I linked to that article. What Arendt means by happiness comes back to what David Bell was talking about with that quote from all the way back on 113. I think he said to some degree about pain and being pain-free. I mean, she has a very Benthamite or utilitarian view. It's maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, or the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Yeah.
So
That's where I got lost before when I was speaking, when I said I got into trouble last time by using the word degradation, but I'm going to use it again, which is to say that in terms of what we've been reading today around labor and work, the idea of hobby, to me, and one can come at this from an entirely different angle, but there's no question that hobby is not a benign category. For example, it's pernicious in terms of meaning, and so it degrades the concept of work. So
she's using hobby in a very degrading sense.
Yes, in a sense, happiness too, because it's so inconsequential next to meaning or struggle, or activism.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and what she says is that we live in a world, and again, I said to you, you say this is not controversial. I said it might be to some, and maybe I'm being too cautious or nice. I don't know, but what she's saying is very harsh, which is that almost nobody today lives with an eye towards meaning. They live as their primary thing to be happy. And to the extent they satisfy their needs and consumption, they engage in hobbies, which are not about creating meaning in the world, but about simply occupying their time. And she says that artists are the one group that have the capacity that we allow to say that they're not working for a living. But even most artists, she says, are really see what they're doing as sort of a kind of subjective expression or playfulness, which reduces art to a hobby as well. I think there's a lot of people who would object to that.
That's the sense in which play does not signify work.
Exactly.
It's simple, so yeah.
That's right. Okay, great. I agree. Nick.
Oh yeah, thank you again for challenging session again that forces me to think, although it's delightful. So I think what the big question in my mind is again, prefacing this saying that I consider myself a thinking person and a person who doesn't like advertisements and so forth and so on, is that through the years, in this last decade especially, I've found that I'm becoming more of a consumer, a smart consumer and a happy consumer than I had been. And I'm wondering, and I'm kind of, again, perhaps picking a quibble with Arendt on her criticism of this futile lives that a consumer person might be living, because because it's futile because we're not in what should be a human life, she thinks, in the world of Homo faber that creates a durable, lasting world. But I wonder if that's fair, though, because I believe that what is driving the wealth and the betterment of people today in the modern society is the fact that we do consume, and that we are consuming beings. I mean, that's what it is. If we were to live in Mars, the first thing we would do would be to rebuild nature, that which, because we need to consume, we would need to have something that will will feed us, to allow us to survive. It wouldn't be the durable world right away. It would be something of nature. So it's part of our nature. And in this dichotomy that she creates, which I think is a more becoming a false dichotomy, is the idea that this this world, this durable world, is indeed durable. Because again, in a consumer society, especially in a technology where we're improving things and changing things, let's say for the better, more efficient, more useful, things have a shorter lifespan. Technology forces us to consume. We had a phone before, we have better phones now. We had a car that worked, it worked good enough, but now we have better cars that are electric and will become self-driving. As technology keeps improving our lives with better things, we are forced to consume to better our lives. And that drives the whole technology and the whole economy. So I mean, I like Arendt's writing, and I believe she's right in many things, but I also believe it's important to question her. And I just want to bring this out as let's say, what if consumerism is a great thing? What if the animal laborans in that page 134, the last statement in the first paragraph, for only the animal laborans and neither the craftsman nor the man of action has ever demanded to be happy or thought that mortal men could be happy. So I'm with the camp that I think a lot of the meaning in life is about finding a way to happiness. And that goes back to Aristotle. That goes back to the ancient Greeks. So I am not one that would embrace suffering, one that would embrace, let's say, depth of meaning, or even freedom. The reason I want freedom is because it leads to happiness. So I am at this point, up to this point in the book at least, questioning all this stuff of Arendt. Thank you.
So I want to thank you because, I keep saying it's controversial and provocative. And I feel like a lot of people say, oh, it's not, it's what we all agree. And I think you've expressed the view that is the alternative view, or one alternative view, and is why what Arendt's saying is provocative and controversial. So, and I think it's what most people, and in fact, more people than maybe even admit to themselves, believe. And so I appreciate your clearly and honestly and articulately presenting it. You say we are consuming beings and it makes us happy. And we get more and more better things and phones, and it's ever more comfortable. I think there's a few things to say. One is, does it make us happy? Right. I mean, again, I hazard to embrace happiness studies, which has become a thing in the academy and I think is a joke of some sorts, but there's all sorts of attempts to measure happiness. And to the extent they do so, it's not very positive. We live in a time of, I can tell you as a faculty member at an elite liberal arts college, students are increasingly depressed and unhappy. We have an entire part of our pharmaceutical industry is designed precisely with the fact that people are increasingly unhappy. And the entire entertainment industry, I think, is largely a result of the fact that people are unhappy and need to be distracted, not to mention drugs. And well, that's part of the pharmaceutical or the illegal pharmaceutical industry that David Bell was talking about earlier. So, when you say that this makes us happier and that people are happy in this world, I think we have to at least ask the question of, is that true? And I'm skeptical of it is, but I appreciate your bringing the alternative view. You know, for you mentioned Aristotle. Aristotle does not use the word happiness. The word he uses that is translated in many English translations for as happiness is eudaimonia,
eudaimonia.
which oi is the preface that means blessed, and daimon is a demonic figure. What Aristotle says we strive for is not happiness, but a kind of demonic blessedness, and that is a far cry from kind of contentment or being drugged and entertained, or consumed into happiness. So what is lost? Let me just finish. I mean, what is lost in this turn towards happiness? You say, because you say, well, what's really bad about it? For Arendt, it is the fact that human beings need to live in a world that has meaning. They simply cannot. There's a famous part of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals in which he says, man can survive all sorts of depredations and pain as long as he thinks there's a purpose for it. Purpose here is another word for meaning, as long as he thinks his life is meaningful. Dostoevsky makes a similar point in the part of the brothers Karamazov on the Grand Inquisitor. The point is that there's a part of man that is simply not content with bread and circus, that needs more, that needs meaning. And what Arendt says is, we are the kind of beings who, in our need for meaning, need a world that is somewhat stable and need a world that has some boundaries. And if we are alienated from that world, and through the speed of constant, you can't just change, as you said, every couple of years. You see this with a lot of older people today, but at some point the change is too fast and they just can't keep up. And Arendt talks about that in some of her writings as well. The speed of change is too fast, and that there's a need for a home and need for kind of a non-alienated world. So that's I know you wanted to answer and say something back to me, but that's her view.
Well, sorry, I just wanted to kind of amend a bit. Maybe happiness might have been too strong a word. I mean, or happiness in the sense of the lack of suffering, or the reduction of suffering, or the absence of suffering, is another definition that philosophers have used. But the point I think that I'm making in response to is, all this consumerism also leads to me an enlargement of life. Life becomes bigger by having some of the things that we experience that we were not able to experience before, by having some of the tools that we have. But all of this, no matter what, this world that is durable, they're all transient, because in 5 years, that thing that you have is already obsoleted, and therefore scheduled for replacement, in order to, again, better enjoy the life that you can have. Now, it may sound very hedonistic, but I do think that there's I don't know.
I think
overestimation of overemphasis on suffering and meaning, because the meaning that happens in the modern world, at least, is a meaning we make out of our lives, not a meaning of things, but self-created meaning, and that can happen anywhere, in a laboring life as well as in an artist's life or a thinker's life.
I think you're expressing
personal,
I think you're expressing a very profound point, and one that is an important counter and response to Arendt. And I'm glad that it's out there. I think, you know, Arendt has a particular view of, as Amanda asked, about freedom and meaning and happiness. And she doesn't think. She thinks that the consumer lifestyle, to use Vivian's word, degrades human life into a life that pursues happiness without being able to attain it, and leaves us adrift, and also leaves us without a connection to each other. We each basically need to be, you know, we need an individual Netflix algorithm or an individual YouTube algorithm that will, you know, make me happy and you happy. And we end up becoming completely isolated and separated from each other. And we enter into these kind of silos and polarizations, and we lose the ability to create common narratives. And it may be that we have just, you know, entered a world in which common meanings and common narratives are no longer possible. And that's the world we're in. And, you know, you're saying it's pretty good, I like it. And Arendt's saying this is a disaster because we lose meaning. And as we enter these siloed worlds, each one of us has a different view of the world, and we each have our own personal truth and personal morality. And not only is that dangerous politically and for totalitarianism reasons, because we each live in a fantasy, you know, the very human idea of a collective life where we pursue meaningful goals and common goals is made obsolete. And, you know, and again, this is where I say what she's saying is think what we're doing. It's not clear to me she thinks we can stop that. And so then the question is, how do we live in this consumerist world? You know, but there's no doubt that there's a different valuation between her and you on these questions.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just want to make, this is not exactly what I believe in. I'm just positing a thought that is counter to hers, because I don't think she's completely right, and yet she's not completely wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just positing that what if, you know, we think this way.
I appreciate the devil's advocate.
Bad?
I appreciate the devil's advocate, and I also want to say that don't retreat from your position. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I think that the position you've articulated is one that is the dominant. She would say it's where we're headed, and we need to think about it. So I was going to say unthinking, and I don't want to insult it, but I mean, I think she would think it's the sort of unthinking direction that we're going in, not in the sense that it's wrong, but it's the way we're headed. It's who we've become. And we will, you know, with this word, the motor for this is what she's going to talk about in the last chapter on Vita Activa and the human condition. That's where she's going to argue and try and argue about how this happened and why it happened. And so we'll get there in the last chapter. I know there's some other questions, and I apologize, but it's 3:00 and I actually have another meeting I have to go to today. So I'm sorry for Lena, Max, and Robert that I can't get to your questions today. If you'd like, you can email me, and I will try and make sure I incorporate them into my introduction next week. I just have to go. I have a meeting I have to go to at 3, so I'm gonna.
What's your email, Roger?
Oh, it's pretty easy to find, but it's Berkowit without a Z at bar.edu.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you all. I enjoy your holiday.
Thank you all.
Whether it's Passover or Good Friday, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next week.